Okay, hi everyone. I'm here to talk about Nintendo DSi boot ROMs. First, who am I? I'm in the demo scene. I'm a demo coder at these two groups. I made a few Nintendo DS demos. That's how I got to know about the platform. I also worked with on the Melon DS emulator. I wrote patches for the DSP emulation, for example. I've also done some other stuff like Linux 4K intro, tooling, Terraria, mod loader stuff. If you've ever used tconfig, that I was in that team, but that's not really relevant here. I also tried to come to New Line 2 times before, but that didn't work. Like, one time I broke both of my arms the Wednesday before New Line, so anyway, I'm finally here. So about the DSi boot ROMs, they're more or less the only unknown part of the entire system, and they took longest to be done for all Nintendo consoles. The Game Boy Color was 10 years, the WonderSwan was 20 years, but that's not a Nintendo console, so and it also has a history of people trying and failing, so that's interesting. So what is glitching? Well, chips run at a specific voltage and at a specific clock, and if you can circumvent if you can use those what the chip is relying on to give it something else for a short amount of time, things will go wrong because they're not made to be that. And the chip needs a supply voltage, and it's sort of hard to protect against misuses there. So there's multiple ways of glitching. One, the easiest way is voltage glitching, where you have in CMOS a simple NAND gate where if both A and B are 1, these two transistors will conduct and the output will connect to ground. While if either A or B is not 0, it will connect to the supply voltage and the output will be 1. That's how an AND works. But if you, for a very short amount of time, short the supply voltage to ground, the output will actually be 0 when it should have been 1. Well, you of course cannot do that for a long amount, or not a very short amount of time, because then the chip will shut down, and that's not what you want. Second type is clock glitching, where in digital circuits you have registers with data, and every clock edge they will save what's in the input here. There's what's called a combinatorial logic, so just gate. It takes some time to travel, and when there's a clock edge, the signal here, so the data, needs to be stable for some amount of time around the clock edge. So if you somehow introduce a clock edge or make the clock go faster, it will happen somewhere here where the data is not yet stable. Then what will get saved in those registers is basically undefined. The third type is electromagnetic field injection, where you're going to use a coil and you are going to run a very strong current through it for a very short amount of time. This will induct some currents in the chip itself, where you have the base layer, which has the transistors. Well, these transistors are all in the base layers here, and those are connected using metal wires on layers on top. So that's where you are going to induce those currents in. And if you do it when there is a clock edge happening, then the data will not be what it's supposed to be, and then you have a glitch again. Similar but not entirely the same is laser fold injection, which is a bit hard to pull off because, well, you need to fire a laser at the semiconductor. This will cause some electrons and holes to form, which will also cause currents and voltages to show up in the semiconductor. I'm not going to explain why, because semiconductor physics sucks, but the thing is, you need some way for...
You can continue talking.
Oh.
There you go.
You need some way for the laser to actually reach the chip here, because usually those things are in black plastic. So you usually need to etch a hole in there using strong acids, which is not fun. So what is Nintendo DSi? Well, first, what is a Nintendo DS, which is the predecessor? It has 2 ARM chips here and there. The ARM9 runs at 66 megahertz and is responsible for all the graphics stuff, which eventually gets shown on the screen. And there's the ARM7 at half speed, which has the sound, touchscreen, Wi-Fi, microphone and stuff. All the I/O stuff is for the ARM7. There's some shared memory. There's, well, the GBA and Nintendo DS cartridges, and there's some external RAM on a different chip. The Nintendo DSi is mostly a Nintendo DS, except the shared memory is a bit larger. The external memory is now 16 megabytes instead of 4. The GBA stuff got removed. The ARM9 has double the speed, and in all these peripherals there's quite a bit of changes, but you don't see it if you are making games because that's mostly the same. There's now 240 megabyte eMMC, while with the DS there was only 256K flash, which was used for a system menu, but that's now all there with all the games you can install on the console itself instead of the cartridge. There's also, well, now an I2C AES accelerator. For some reason, the sound amplifier is now inside the touchscreen controller, which is a bit weird. There's also cameras and also a power management controller, which is called the TWL, which stands, it probably stands for boot up and power management for the TWL. That's the code name of the DSi. So the boot ROMs, these leave at those addresses. There's a public part and a hidden part. Well, why is that? The public part, it's always accessible. It's mostly leftover from the GBA days, actually. It has a basic protection where you can only access it when the CPU is running code inside the boot ROM, or the public part of the boot ROM. And on the ARM7, there's actually a double protection mechanism, which is basically the same. So if you want to execute something in the BIOS port region, you have, or read something from the BIOS port region, you have to be executing from that region, and otherwise it will fail. Now, the hidden part are controlled using these two system registers. If you ever disable them using those registers, they're simply gone, completely detached from the CPU bus. So, yeah, so you can basically never see them again, which makes them interesting. Now, in the public part, there are the reset vectors, which is where the CPU is hard-coded to start executing, also on an interrupt where it starts executing when that happens. So you have reset vector, which immediately jumps to the hidden part, which is interesting. Then there's an undefined instruction exception, the data abort and prefetch abort. Those simply read a pointer from somewhere in memory and then jump to that pointer. So so that games can put a pointer there and handle those exceptions themselves. Same for the interrupts, basically. There's also the software interrupts, which are hard-coded to run what's called the BIOS routines. Those are the main reason why the public part is there. They have some system reset, memcopy, crypto and compression helper functions, and also sound helpers to, for example, look up the frequency of a given node. Sorry. But of course, the most interesting part is the private part. And well, if the reset vectors goes there, it's probably responsible for booting up the console. It loads a second boot stage from the eMMC, so it probably has an eMMC driver. The second boot stage is AES encrypted and RSA signed, so it supposedly has the keys for that, but that's still not much info. Luckily, you can also, well, here's the main SoC with both the ARM cores and all the other stuff. Here's the 16 megabyte RAM chip, and this is the eMMC, and this is some more context. So if you hook up a logic analyzer to some of those traces, you can see that, well, first of all, it doesn't only access the eMMC, but also a flash chip on, well, there used to be a flash chip here, but I got a photo from someone else. This is a flash chip on the Wi-Fi daughter board, which is usually connected to this yellow connector, which then comes above the CPU stuff. And I mean, it's a bit unclear why it has to read this, because the only thing that's in there is, you know, Wi-Fi access point settings and a few other things. And well, yeah, then it also accesses the eMMC. And the second note is, it's only enables the RAM right before it will load the second boot stage code, which is also right before it will load the system menu, so after starting the second boot stage. So that's an important detail for later. So second thing is, when the boot ROMs get disabled, they can't do this disabling things themselves inside the secured part, because otherwise the next instruction will be garbage. So that code is also available in the public part. And on the ARM7, it just sets 2 magic bits and then returns, while on the ARM9, it's going to wait for that bit to be set. And that code is called by another subroutine, also in the public part, which basically, well, mostly resets some hardware things, but there's also these interesting mem copies. And using another stage 2 boot code exploit, where it has a file parsing bug, you can intercept what these mem copies are doing. These are just RAM addresses. So it's actually leaking AES keys and Blowfish keys, which is interesting. So to attack this, I'm first going to look at other platforms and how boot ROMs were done there, simply for inspiration. So the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color. Well, for the Game Boy, they took the chip, boiled it in acid, and then took it under an electron microscope to read out a mask ROM where you have a light or a dark color is a 0 or 1 bit. People then tried it on the Game Boy Color too, but that did not work. Why? Because the boot ROM on the Game Boy Color uses NAND ROM instead of mask ROM. And while mask ROM is just connecting or not connecting wires to get a 1 or a 0, mask ROM uses flash technology, so that's a transistor with a floating gate with a charge in it, but you cannot see a charge, so a microscope is not going to work. So instead, someone used clock glitching to skip the instruction that disables the boot ROM on the Game Boy Color, and then was able to read it out using, well, an FPGA here. This is a Super Game Boy and a lot of wiring. So on the Game Boy Advance, this is the console that introduced the BIOS routines. So it only has a public BIOS, so that makes things easier. So, well, at first, most of these routines actually have bounce checking to not mem copy out the BIOS itself immediately to somewhere into RAM. That would be too easy. But there's one function which does not have a bound check, and that way you can read it out. This was discovered a long time ago, but it's quite slow, so people discovered even more techniques to dump it. For example, the exception vector still has to use RAM addresses, so if you pre-fill those RAM addresses with code that, with evil addresses, you can use ROB to then eventually read it out and gain code execution in it. There's another thing. The BIOS does not know which instruction the CPU is actually running. It only knows which addresses it is accessing. And because the ARM CPU in the GBA is pipelined, it actually reads addresses 4 bytes ahead of what it's actually executing. So the BIOS on the GBA is at address 0. So if you have code at address FFFFFC, you can actually read the BIOS too, except that's not backed by RAM, so you have to do some tricks with open bus things. And there's a variant of it where you can remap the address space, and then it's easier to do. So on the DS, it's basically the same, except you have also the BIOS prot region. So you now need to find something in the BIOS prot region to be able to read that. So No Cache had the idea to use timer interrupts, which, well, when an interrupt happens, you get the registers, the exception address, and the stack pointer, etc., of when the exception happened. And that way, if you run let a timer interrupt happen, and then run it again, but let it happen one cycle later, and then one cycle later, and then one cycle later, you can basically give an entire trace of what is happening inside the CPU. And that way, I guess it's done that way. He found a thumb read gadget at that address, and then you can just read it again. So the 3DS, this is where the hardware attacks came back. It also has a boot ROM, which is only responsible for booting and the boot ROM vectors, where it also loads stuff from RAM. But on the 3DS, it has the interesting thing where if on a reset, the RAM that has those vectors is not cleared. So if you do a reboot, this will start the boot ROM, and then immediately after cause a glitch, it will still use all the addresses where you can then just have dumper code in RAM. Then there's also a vulnerability in the boot ROM itself, where it uses ASN1 to store the signature of the next boot stage. That parser is broken, so you can fake signatures. On the Wii, you have a register that hides the boot ROM. You can just re-enable it. They kept it in the Wii U for compatibility versions, and they also kept it re-enableable. So that's a fail. Now, on the Wii, this was quite boring, but on the Wii U, it actually also reads keys from OTPs and then disables you from loading them. So what people did is, well, boot 0 copies itself into RAM because otherwise it would be slow, and then loads the next boot stage at a lower address. But if you glitch the size check of boot 1, you can basically make it to override boot 0, and then you have code execution. And that's all on the ARM coprocessor on the Wii, which is called the Starlet or the Starbuck. Most games run on a PowerPC. On a Wii, it simply runs from RAM, while on the Wii U there's a boot ROM, but the details are technical. Here's a link, but if you time a soft reset quickly enough, it will, well, you can also get code execution under it. Finally, on the Switch, well, first people bypassed the boot ROM safety check by simply glitching a SHA-1 check, which is stored in the OTP, so it's burned inside the CPU die. This is stored on the eMMC, and well, it's supposed to verify the RSA pub key used with that from the OTP, but if it's glitched, you can just put whatever there. Now, that's too late to read the boot ROM itself, so what multiple people actually did, mostly independently actually, is to also use mostly voltage glitching to also skip over the instruction that disables the boot ROM. So, how do you do it on the DSi? Well, first, how did I get into it? Arisota, who is the main developer of Melon DS, was working on Nintendo DSi emulation, and she was kind of annoyed because, well, you can only start with stage 2, because that's what's on the eMMC, but how exactly it should be stored and what registers should be in what state, it's not very clear, so she wanted a ROM dump. And you need quite a bit of equipment, often FPGA, oscilloscope, a bunch of other things. So I go to uni, so I said, why don't I do it, even though there's like a history of people failing. I did not know what I was getting into, but yeah. So how do you actually do it? Well, first thing, you could, like in the Wii, check if the sconfig ROM bits, you can just enable it again, but sadly that doesn't work. Maybe we could glitch the RSA verification check. That's indeed possible, but that's still, well, you'll get code execution, but after the boot ROMs have been disabled. So that's also not useful. You could skip over the instruction on the ARM7 that disables the boot ROMs, but then the ARM9 will hang, and then the console still will not boot. So, yeah, luckily, the vector glitch attack from the 3DS, you can basically reuse it on the DSi because the RAM is also not cleared, mostly. So, this is actually not a new idea. People have tried this before, but they all failed. Well, on that forum thread, well, the ARM9 could not be glitched, except when it was too late. And the ARM7, well, they couldn't glitch it at all. Well, on the ARM9, that was simply because, remember the thing about the RAM chip enable thing where I talked about here earlier? Its exception vectors are in that RAM, while on the ARM7, it's in a tiny bit of RAM internal to the SoC. So if you do an undefined instruction on the ARM9, it's just going to jump into unmapped memory and then it's going to hang. And why did they not get it to work in the ARM7? Well, Nocash admitted that he didn't remove the, what's it called? Decoupling capacitors, which are capacitors that are attached to the power supply of a chip to filter out noise from other chips. If you quickly short it to ground, it's going to see that noise and filter it out. So you really need to remove those, and he kind of forgot to do that, so that's not good. So what we're going to do, we're going to use electromagnetic field injection, simply to not have to mess with the decoupling capacitors. Well, that's the positive point. The negative point is, with voltage glitching, you can only choose when you do a glitch and for how long. With electromagnetic field injection, well, there's those two parameters, but also you can choose how strong the glitch is and where exactly you will place the probe above the chip, because that also has an influence. And before we can start doing this on the boot ROM, we also first need to get it to glitch in the first place at all. So when I came to the lab, well, I first checked which RAM regions are actually persistent between reboots, because I'll need to put a payload somewhere in there. As this RAM chip is persistent, but that's not useful. There's some regions in the SoC internal RAM, and there's also what's called the Wi-Fi RAM, which is used to send packets to the Wi-Fi chip and back. So I opted for the last one, and then I also checked for the RAM enable thing. And we also, for the electromagnetic field injection, you have to place a probe here, but this Wi-Fi board usually is above here, so we have to remove it. But because the SPI chip, flash chip is on there, which the boot ROM needs, we still have to connect it, so there's a bunch of ugly wires and glue to make it work. Anyway, it works, so that's great. And then we simply tested some GPIO and LED connections to signal something to the entire equipment that will perform the glitching. And we also use I2C to have printf. And we also need some custom firmware, because the default firmware will try to initialize the Wi-Fi chip, which, well, we only have the SPI things connected here, because otherwise it will be incredibly hard to do. So yeah, luckily an old version of the custom firmware does not yet initialize Wi-Fi chips, so we can just ignore it for now. So how do we test a glitching setup? Well, first, because we're going to try to cause an undefined instruction exception. So we set up the handler, which, if it succeeds, will blink one of those LEDs, which is connected to the setup, and then signal some other thing, which will make the glitching setup start attempting to glitch, and then try every single possible combination of time and duration and strength and position. And well, if it's worked correctly, then there's a correct set of parameters that can actually be used to glitch. This takes a long time. And then we found, well, nothing, sadly. Why is this? Well, first we used a commercial glitching device, which cost a lot, but its power output is actually not that high. So luckily, people at the lab had a custom glitching probe left over from earlier research, which has a higher power output. So with that, it was actually working quite fast, like within a few days. And which is actually fast because it has to do incredibly tiny steps over the entire thing, so yeah. Well, right after it worked, the thing that moves the probe around broke down, so then we had to work for new supplies and then do the run again, but hey, it works. So now we can engineer a payload where first all the SoC internal RAM, we fill it with mostly an obsolete, and then have the exception vector run to the start of it. Because while the Wi-Fi RAM contains a payload, you first need to set a magic enable bit somewhere in the register in order to enable that RAM somewhere. So that's also done in the obsolete. And I've also taken into account that while we're mostly targeting the unified instruction, Could also possibly be that the instruction decoder would make the CPU jump to somewhere in RAM somehow. So I also engineered it to be dual ARM and thumb code, and we also mostly addresses that point to somewhere in here. So that's some interesting code which you can find here. It also contains a payload if you're interested. So the payload itself, it checks whether the boot ROMs are enabled. If they are, that's one of the things, otherwise it's the other, like one of these two, I don't know which are which, but hey. If it's successful, it just dumps the entire boot ROM to I2C. If it fails, it just issues a reboot using the power management thing. So this worked. It's about 26K in size, and I know it works simply because it contained the string Nintendo. And also because it's mostly ARM code, I cannot read this assembly by hand, but if you see all these E's here, here, and here, that's an artifact of how ARM instructions are encoded. So if you see those E's in columns, you can be pretty sure that it's ARM code. And here's the SHA-2 512, etc. So what's actually in there? So we have AES keys and Blowfish keys. Mostly those that are actually already copied out, but some that are not, which is interesting. It sadly does not contain the RSA keys. I'll explain later why. And it's 90% code, and you have no symbols, basically no strings. Like the Nintendo from earlier, that's actually an AES key, not a displayed string. So yeah, and how does it work? Well, first it initializes some hardware, then it resets the exception vector, so chances are high we glitched it at a really early moment. So then it reads a header with the RSA signature and eMMC offset and load address of the second boot stage. It sends that to the ARM9, waits a bit, then gets it back. It presumably does the RSA verification at that moment. I'm not sure because I don't have the ARM9 yet. So then it reads the stage 2 blobs from the eMMC, decrypts it using the AES accelerator, and then sends it to the ARM9, which then supposedly does a SHA-1 calculation on it. And if it gets an OK back from the ARM9, it will first copies the keys into RAM. Well, that public code we already saw. So it resets hardware, then logs boot ROMs, and then jumps to the second stage, and ARM9 basically does the same. If it doesn't match, it just locks up. That's the global overview. There's also a few interesting things. It uses an unknown register, which no code ever before used. Nobody knows what it does, but it's there. And also, if you have a magic key combination, it will try to boot from a Nintendo DS cartridge, which the 3DS also does. And there, using the RSA or ASN1 exploit, you can run a homebrew that way. And well, it needs a certain select and the lid to be closed, but that you can bypass by simply holding a magnet here, and then it thinks the lid is closed because the coil of the speakers here also have a magnet, and here there's a magnet sensor. So that's how that works. Whether we can use NTR boot, we still don't know because there's reasons which I'll talk about later. Because, well, hex on the 3DS relies on the ASN1 parser stuff. The DSi does not use ASN1, it just uses raw signatures, so there's nothing to be parsed and nothing to find, and no code to find bugs in. 3DS boot ROMs also have the interesting thing where the two cores exchange function pointers for code to run, which is interesting. So you can, if you take over one of them, you can send over a function pointer, and then the other one will run your code too. And I've asked several people to look at the dump, and nobody found a thing. So yeah, that's a bit sad, but it's also interesting that the DSi is actually more secure than the 3DS. Yeah, we'll need another round of glitching to get to ARM9 boot ROM. So how do we do that? Well, there's the ROM-WE magic switch. Is it a reset signal? Maybe. Does it make sconfig ROM not a one-shot thing, so you can re-enable the boot ROMs again later on, or maybe it makes the ROM area writable. I mean, it's ROM WE, so maybe ROM write enabled, maybe. But yeah, I've tried it and none of these things worked, simply because the disable bit on that register is incredibly early, so the timing is probably too tight. Or maybe it's just leftover from development hardware. Now it's just hardwired to a 0 or something. So for the other two ideas, well, this is the regular boot flow I already explained. We could also do a glitch here, but instead of just dumping it, we could just pretend to be the normal ARM7 boot ROM and then forget to lock the boot ROMs. This will cause ARM9 to glitch, to hang, but if you then glitch that check again, we can continue regular boot sequence while the boot ROMs are still enabled. We can do it this way instead of the earlier way, using an ARM7 takeover, simply because now we can actually tell the glitching setup to start glitching the ARM9 instead of doing it blindly. Because without the signal, you don't know if you've just crashed everything or whether the ARM9 is actually waiting for the signal, and that's not useful. Another idea is to somehow get evil code in ARM9 memory by glitching here somewhere and then sending over the evil code, or maybe we can just store it on the eMMC. So while the ARM9 is calculating the SHA-1 hash over a huge blob, we can glitch it somewhere and then hope it ends up somewhere here. That's less intensive on the code side of the payload, but it has a few issues that, well, if you need a payload on the eMMC, that's annoying because the eMMC wears out really quickly, like within 100 write cycles it's gone. You also need some way to get code out of the ARM9 payload because all the peripherals are in the ARM7. There's basically nothing on the ARM9 except one thing is the cartridge save game thing, which is basically an SPI bus. Except that also needs a power on switch on the ARM7, so that's still annoying. So yeah, right now I'm trying to do the ARM7 takeover thing, so this thing, but you know, you have to know where to start pretending to be the ARM7. So I first need to know where exactly it's most often glitching, so I'm working on that. So yeah, this is still quite hard, so if you have suggestions or hardware to do this, your help is welcome. Luckily, there's some other things I can talk about. So yeah, for NTR boot, there's no SIG hacks, but maybe, I mean, there's like one magic byte in the eMMC header. Nobody knows what it's for. Maybe it's a switch to choose between raw signatures and ASN1, hopefully. Maybe there's like a simple buffer overflow. Well, if all else fails, we can always factor an RC1024 key, but that's never been done before, so yeah, that's also going to be fun. So that's actually not, in fact, the only obscure thing in the DSi. There's a DSP that like one shovelware game uses and nothing else. It's actually more powerful than the ARM9. It doesn't have a boot ROM because it just runs from RAM, but there's actually some code out there where you can run code on it and write your own code for it. There's actually even an LLVM port. The Wi-Fi chip, which is completely different from the old DS Wi-Fi chip, it's now an Ethereum 6K based thing with an extensor core. It's, well, the firmware itself is in the system files on the eMMC, but it also has a boot ROM. But if you write an SDIO driver, you can read it out using magic registers. And same thing with the PoroCYon, you have these game cards, and instead of using the same local Wi-Fi where you used to play Mario Kart with each other, for example, Mario Kart uses the Wi-Fi to set up a local network to play with each other, while this thing uses infrared. And the interesting thing is the DS does not have infrared itself, so what they did is they put an infrared transceiver inside the cartridge. And it's not just an infrared transceiver, it's actually the same microcontroller as inside the PoroCYon itself, just with a slightly different program. simply because it has an infrared transceiver built in. So there's magic SPI commands you can send over the save game bus thing to just read it out. That's some discovered obscure things. There's undiscovered obscure things. There's the power management chip, which is actually a 78K microcontroller. On the 3DS, its firmware is also in on the eMMC. On the DSi, that's not the case, sadly. It might be dumpable with a hardware debugger tool from Renesas, but those cost hundreds or maybe thousands. If you have one of these, please come talk to me. The touch screen controller has a mini DSP from TI. They are incredibly secretive about how a mini DSP actually works, so that's also interesting to look at. But there's also the cameras here. Those are that model number. You actually have an 8-bit 68 HC11, which is an old 8-bit thing. Well, if you've ever heard of the Vectrex, it actually has a similar CPU as that one, which is an interesting fact for trivia nights. That MCU also has a 32K ROM inside, which you cannot read, but you can actually read a different different locations in the address space of the CPU, including its stack. While making the slides, I've once tried to take it over, but that didn't work. But I only looked one afternoon at it, so if you want to do something interesting, here's a challenge. So yeah, conclusion, it's hard, but we're getting there eventually. And often if things are dismissed as we know how it works, well, not really. There's always things to be discovered. I also want to thank Arthur Dekkers and Leonard Wouters from the COSIC lab to help me a lot with the actual hardware glitching setup. I want to thank PoroCYon 100, Normat, Cyrus, and a few others for help with software reverse engineering, because I'm incredibly bad at it. I also want to thank X, Blasty, and others of Titan for financial support, simply because I did not want to sacrifice my own console for that. And also Blasty, 10 years ago, also did Nintendo DSi hacking and made a thing where you can snoop the cartridge bus, which is useful because then you can finally have printf on the ARM9, because otherwise it's impossible, which is incredibly useful for debugging. I also want to thank lots of friends, which I'm not going to name here, simply for proofreading, watching me rehearse this talk, etc. So you can contact me that way. Are there any questions? Also, the slides are online for all those links. So, any questions? Okay, I guess that's it then.